On June 15, 1897, the wooden immigration station at Ellis Island caught fire just after midnight. Within 2 hours, the entire facility was gone, burned to the foundation. Every federal and state arrival record dating back to 1855 was destroyed. More than 1.5 million individual documents vanished. Those papers covered 42 years of the largest wave of immigration in American history. They held the only official proof for Irish families fleeing famine, Jewish refugees from the Russian Empire, Italian laborers, German craftsmen, Polish factory workers, and thousands more whose surnames or origins carried the old label Tartar. The woman who remembers being called a Tartar on her grandmother's porch still carries that word with no context. The single document that would have decoded it for her burned that night. Federal officials had seized New York State's Castle Garden passenger lists covering arrivals from 1855 to 1890. They transported those records to Ellis Island for centralized storage. They took the only copies of those state records and housed them in a building made entirely of pine. When the fire came, there was no fallback, no duplicate set in Albany, no copies in county offices, just ash. The replacement station was built from fireproof brick and opened in December 1900. Officials clearly understood what had been lost. They rebuilt the building to withstand the next fire. They never attempted to rebuild the records. Thousands of immigrants who had entered the country legally now had no proof of lawful arrival. Their legal status depended on a document that no longer existed inside a building that officials had known was a fire hazard from the day it opened. For their grandchildren, the loss ran deeper. A slur like Tartar, once whispered with contempt, could never be traced to a village, a ship manifest, or a border crossed under a specific name. I have spent months tracking the others across more than a century of American records. The fire at Ellis Island was not random. The targets are always the same kind of building. The losses always fall hardest on the people with the least power to fight back. January 10, 1921, the Commerce Department building in Washington. A fire erupts in the basement around 5 in the afternoon near the boiler room and carpenter's shop. In that basement, stacked on pine shelves in an unlocked file room, sit the original population schedules of the 1890 census. Other decades of census data sat safely inside fireproof vaults. The 1890 records rested on wooden shelves right next to the furnace room. And the 1890 census was the first for which the government dropped its long-standing requirement that backup copies be filed in local offices. Every prior census had duplicates in county courthouses across the country. This one did not. When the basement filled with smoke, there was nothing to recover from. In each case, the pattern repeats. Records that established a claim to identity or origin burned. In each case, no backup existed. In each case, the critical documents for the most vulnerable populations were the ones stored on pine shelves next to furnaces. The damaged records from the Commerce Building sat in a warehouse for over a decade afterward rotting. In December 1932, the Census Bureau quietly recommended their destruction. Congress authorized it on February 21, 1933. The cornerstone for the National Archives had been laid one day earlier. Out of 62,979,766 people recorded in that census, only 6,160 entries survived. That is less than 1/100th of 1%. Old buildings burned constantly in this country. The United States in the 1800s and early 1900s was an incubator for catastrophic fire. Pine construction everywhere, inadequate electrical wiring, oil lamps and gas fixtures standing inches from paper records. Every individual fire on this list has a plausible accidental explanation. Genealogists mostly treat these events as tragic coincidences. Most historians do too. And if I were looking at a single fire, I would join them without hesitation. I am not looking at a single fire. The woman who remembers being called a Tartar still waits for an answer that the flames took away. Her family's claim to its own story evaporated with the paper. Someone else stepped into the gap, and the direction of that transfer never reverses. The replacement buildings rose fireproof. The records never did. The pattern continued into county courthouses across the South and border states. On September 10, 1932, 15 white men set fire to a courthouse in Paulding, Mississippi. Inside sat every property deed and land title for the black eastern half of Jasper County. Records for the white western half were stored in a separate building miles away. By 1938, a corporation had claimed over 9,000 acres of formerly black-owned land. Courts granted clear title because nobody could produce a competing deed anymore. The deeds had burned along with everything else inside that courthouse. 850,000 barrels of oil have since been pumped from that property. That was one fire in one county on one night in September. The woman who remembers being called a Tartar carries a parallel void. The word that marked her childhood pointed to an ethnic origin her family could no longer document. The paper trail that would have decoded the slur burned in events like this one. I have spent months tracking the others across more than a century of American records. The fires spanned 1897 to 1973, and the targets are always the same kind of building. The losses always fall hardest on the people with the least power to fight back. In 2001, the Associated Press published an investigation that reporters spent years compiling. It was later entered into the Congressional Record on February 6, 2002. Their team examined 13 southern and border states, interviewed more than 1,000 people, and reviewed tens of thousands of public records. What they found was staggering. Approximately one-third of county courthouses in southern and border states had burned at least once since the Civil War. In Georgia and Alabama, that figure exceeded 40%. Paulding was not unique. It was simply the best documented. 15 men, a deliberate act, a safe found open the next morning with its contents reduced to ash. Property records for the vulnerable gone. Property records for others preserved in a different building. The Ku Klux Klan had already been attacking black farms in Jasper County before that night, burning houses, lynching farmers, running families off their land. The courthouse fire finished what the violence had started. Once the paper trail was gone, the land grab could proceed through a courtroom. Masonite Corporation filed in December 1937, claimed 9,581 acres, and told the court it could locate no one with a rival claim. Of course it could not. The rival claims had burned 5 years earlier. The court ruled in the company's favor in 1938. The AP later confirmed that at least 204.5 of those acres had been taken from black owners already driven out by the Klan. Millions of dollars in oil and timber have since flowed from that land. International paper owns it now. The AP found more than fire damage in those courthouses. In county after county, reporters discovered deed books with pages physically torn from them, file folders emptied of their contents, tax records altered in crude handwriting, documents that custodians openly admitted were marked for shredding. The investigators physically retrieved dozens of records that were days away from being destroyed by the very offices tasked with preserving them. Fire was only the loudest instrument. A quieter erasure had been happening in plain sight for decades. The scale of what disappeared is hard to absorb even as numbers. In 1910, black Americans owned between 16 and 19 million acres of farmland. That represented roughly 925,000 farms, about 14% of all farms in the country. By 1997, 90% of that acreage was gone. Black farmers held fewer than 3 million acres. A team of economists affiliated with the American Bar Association calculated the cumulative value of lost black agricultural land compounded forward to 2020. Their conservative estimate came to $326 billion. That number does not include businesses seized after records vanished. It does not include oil pumped from Jasper County. It does not include timber harvested from land whose ownership documents burned in any of the hundreds of courthouse fires across the South. It counts only the farmland, only the dirt. What fraction of that 326 billion traces directly to a fire? Nobody can calculate it. The records that would make the calculation possible are the very records that burned. Similar patterns erased ethnic identity claims for groups labeled with slurs like Tartar. The backup policy drop left origin and name records without local duplicates. The critical documents sat on pine shelves next to furnaces. In each case, someone lost the ability to prove a claim to their heritage. In each case, someone else stepped into the gap. The direction of that transfer never reverses. The woman who remembers being called a Tartar lives inside that exact pattern. The slur remains a mystery because the supporting documents vanished. The pattern escalated across multiple sites and decades. The losses mounted into a systematic removal of vulnerable histories. Quiet erasure tactics supplemented the fires. Pages were torn from deed books. File folders were emptied. Tax records were altered in crude handwriting. Documents were marked for shredding by the very custodians tasked with protecting them. Investigators saved some at the last moment. The public never saw the full extent. In each case, the records critical to the most vulnerable population were the ones that burned. In each case, the institutional response was not restoration, but slow abandonment. July 12, 1973, the National Personnel Records Center in suburban St. Louis. Fire breaks out on the 6th floor shortly after midnight. Firefighters arrive in under 5 minutes. They reach the blaze and begin working. The heat drives them back when their protective masks start melting against their skin. The fire burns uncontrolled for 22 hours. Full suppression takes 4.5 days. Hotspots persist for nearly a month. Between 16 and 18 million military personnel files are destroyed. 80% of Army records for service members discharged between 1912 and 1960. 75% of Air Force records for certain surname ranges discharged between 1947 and 1963. These files documented service in the First World War, the Second World War, Korea, and early Vietnam. They were the primary evidence veterans needed for disability claims, healthcare access, home loans, and burial honors. For descendants of families once labeled with slurs like Tartar, these files sometimes held the final surviving thread to an ethnic heritage the earlier fires had already begun to erase. The building had no fire alarm in its storage areas, no sprinkler system. Officials had explicitly argued against sprinklers, citing concerns about theoretical water damage from leaking pipes. They protected the records from hypothetical water and left them exposed to actual fire. No copies of these files existed. No microfilm had been produced. No catalog of the building's contents had ever been created. The full extent of the loss is literally unknowable because nobody inventoried what was there before it burned. More than 50 years later, the National Archives still processes over 30,000 fire-damaged records each year. Technicians in a climate-controlled room in St. Louis carefully peel apart charred pages, trying to recover the identities the flames obscured. Some records crumble at the touch. Others are legible only under infrared light. I need to tell you where I almost abandoned this script. I had the fires documented. I had the dates and the numbers and the AP investigation. I set the entire project aside for 3 days because I could hear the reasonable counter-argument, so clearly it drowned out everything else. Fires are common in old buildings. Government incompetence is a sufficient explanation. Negligence is not malice. And I think that counter-argument is largely correct. I believe most of these fires were exactly what they appear to be. Accidents in buildings that had no business holding irreplaceable records. But that word "most" is where I cannot get comfortable. Because in Paulding it was not an accident. 15 men and an open safe. And here is what I cannot resolve. Whether the fire in the Commerce building was set by a furnace or a hand does not change the gap in the record. Whether the NPRC fire started from a cigarette or from sabotage does not change the form letter a veteran receives explaining that his service file no longer exists. Intent changes the morality. It does not change the mathematics. And the mathematics always point the same direction. Someone with a legitimate claim loses the ability to prove it. Someone without documentation problems acquires what was lost. Every fire on this list erased records that established a claim. At Ellis Island, the claim was to legal entry and citizenship. With the 1890 census, the claim was to documented property, family structure, and national existence. In the courthouses, the claim was to land, to deeds, to proof of generational ownership. At the NPRC, the claim was to military benefits, disability compensation, health care, and the burial honors earned by service. For the woman who remembers being called a Tartar, the claim was to the simple knowledge of what the word meant and where her family truly came from. In each case, no backup existed. In each case, the records critical to the most vulnerable population were the ones that burned. In each case, the institutional response was not restoration, but slow abandonment. If your family was ever called a Tartar, there is a fire between you and the document that would explain it. If your family came through New York before 1897, there is an island fire between you and their arrival documentation. If your grandfather served between 1912 and 1964, there is a warehouse fire between you and his service file. If anyone in your family was counted in 1890, there is a government fire between you and the most detailed portrait of them the country ever attempted. How many of your family's claims burned in a building where someone decided a sprinkler system was not worth the cost? The United States did not establish its national archives until 1934. 158 years passed between the Declaration of Independence and the construction of a fireproof federal building to house the nation's records. The appropriation did not come for decades. Paper burns. Claims burn with it. When the claims are gone, the land changes hands, the benefits go uncollected, and the meaning of a single spoken word remains forever out of reach. The family history hits a wall that looks like bad luck, but functions like a toll booth. Whether you call what happened conspiracy or negligence, or simply the ordinary machinery of a country that stored poor people's records in flammable basements, the practical accounting is identical. Records burned, claims evaporated, wealth and identity transferred, family trees dead ended. And every time the people who lost the most were the people with the least power. They could not demand fireproof vaults. They got pine shelves next to furnaces. If you wanted to strip an inheritance from a population that could not fight back, you would not need a coordinated conspiracy. You would just need to keep filing their records in wooden buildings with no sprinklers, no alarms, no copies, and no consequences when the inevitable happened. The oil wells still pump from land whose deeds burned decades earlier. And somewhere in St. Louis, a preservation technician is holding a charred page up to the light. She is trying to read a name and a story that somebody's grandchild has been waiting more than 50 years to connect to the word Tartar spoken on a porch one humid summer evening.